JD Vance denied service at restaurant. His next move shocked everyone. JD Vance pulled into the parking lot of Owen's Diner, a small but well-known establishment in the heart of Springfield, Ohio. The neon sign flickered slightly, casting a dim glow over the entrance, and the scent of grilled burgers and fresh coffee wafted through the cool night air. It was the kind of place that had been around for decades, where the same customers occupied the same booths every evening, a staple of the community. He had heard about it earlier that day from a local who swore by their homemade meatloaf and hand-cut fries, and after a long day of meetings, handshakes, and policy discussions, he wanted nothing more than to sit down for a quiet meal before the long drive back. As he stepped out of his car, he stretched his shoulders, feeling the exhaustion settle in. The bell above the door jingled softly as he entered, and for a brief moment, the scene before him seemed welcoming. The warm lighting, the low hum of conversation, the clatter of plates and silverware, and the comforting scent of sizzling bacon and freshly brewed coffee. It was the kind of place where time moved a little slower, where the faces on the faded Polaroids by the register told stories of decades past, and where the waitresses probably knew most of their customers by name. JD stepped toward the counter, catching the eye of the hostess, a woman in her early 40s with her hair tied back in a loose ponytail. She was mid-smile, the automatic kind of greeting that came with years of working in customer service, but the second she recognized him, something shifted. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but he caught it. The brief hesitation, the slight tensing of her shoulders, the way her lips pressed together in a thin line. He had been in enough rooms to know when he wasn't entirely welcome. As he glanced around, he noticed a few customers turning their heads toward him, some whispering, others simply watching. A man at the counter, halfway through his burger, leaned in toward the person across from him and muttered something. A woman in a flannel shirt set down her coffee cup a little too hard, her gaze flickering toward JD before looking away. The shift in energy was subtle but undeniable. JD wasn't naive. He had spent enough time in the public eye to recognize tension when he felt it. This wasn't just curiosity, this was something more. He exhaled slowly, keeping his posture relaxed as he stepped forward. The hostess hesitated again, then finally spoke, her voice careful. "Good evening. Are you dining in or taking out?" The question itself was ordinary, but the way she said it carried something unspoken, a quiet uncertainty. JD offered a small, tired chuckle. "Dining in, if that's all right." Another pause, too long for such a simple exchange. She glanced over her shoulder toward the kitchen, then back at him. "I need to check something real quick, just one moment." And with that, she disappeared through the swinging door, leaving JD standing there, aware that something about this night was about to unfold in a way he hadn't expected. JD Vance stood in place, his hands resting casually at his sides, but his mind was already processing the shift in the room. The brief pause in conversation, the glances exchanged between customers, the barely perceptible tightening of the air. It was the kind of tension that wasn't loud, but was undeniably present. He had felt it before, in rooms where people had already made up their minds about him, before he ever spoke a word. But here, in a small-town diner where people came for comfort food and routine, the weight of the moment felt different. The hostess had disappeared into the back, and as the seconds stretched, JD became increasingly aware of the subtle shifts around him. A man at the counter, wearing a blue work jacket frayed at the cuffs, stirred his coffee a little slower now, his gaze flickering toward JD before quickly looking away. In one of the booths, a woman adjusted her napkin repeatedly, her fingers fidgeting as if trying to find something else to focus on. Across the room, a younger man, probably in his 30s, leaned back with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable, but his posture exuding the kind of casual defiance that suggested he was enjoying the scene unfolding before him. JD exhaled, keeping his stance relaxed, but there was no ignoring the fact that eyes were on him, not just watching, but waiting. It wasn't clear what they were waiting for. His reaction, perhaps, or maybe just confirmation that their assumptions about him were correct. The murmur of voices had dulled, not entirely silent, but subdued enough to be noticeable. The sizzle of the grill in the back was now the loudest sound in the diner, along with the occasional scrape of a fork against a plate. Something was happening here, something unspoken but heavy. He glanced toward the kitchen, catching a glimpse of two cooks standing just beyond the counter, partially obscured by the heat lamp stacked with plates. Their faces were unreadable, but their posture said enough. They were paying attention, waiting just like everyone else. Then the hostess returned, stepping back through the swinging door, but this time she didn't have the hesitant, uncertain look from before. Now her expression was set, her lips pressed firmly together as if a decision had been made. She met his gaze, her voice firmer than before. "I'm sorry, sir. We can't serve you tonight." The words landed heavily, not just because of what was said, but because of how they were said. Without explanation, without apology, without any attempt to soften the message. For a moment, JD said nothing. The words just hung there between them, thick and heavy, and in that silence, the entire diner seemed to tighten around them. The older man at the counter shifted slightly, stabbing at the last of his eggs, shaking his head to himself but saying nothing. A woman in the far booth lowered her cup, her expression unreadable. The younger man with his arms crossed smirked, as if he had been waiting for this exact moment. JD took it all in, measuring the moment, considering his next move. He had options. He could turn around and leave, shaking his head, letting it go. He could challenge them, demand an explanation, call out the unfairness of it all, ask if they had any idea how this would look in the morning's news cycle. But as he glanced around, seeing the mix of reactions, the ones avoiding eye contact, the ones who watched too closely, the ones who seemed uncomfortable but unwilling to say anything, he knew that this wasn't just about him. This was about what his presence represented to them. He let out a slow breath, settling his hands on his hips. "Did I do something wrong?" His voice was even, not aggressive, just direct. The hostess didn't fidget this time. "It's just, we'd rather not serve you tonight." No explanation. "No, we're closing soon." Just that. JD studied her face, but she had already set her position, and the entire diner felt like it was holding its breath, waiting to see how he would respond. JD Vance stood there, the words settling between him and the hostess like an invisible wall. "We'd rather not serve you tonight." No excuse, no polite deflection, just a direct refusal. The weight of the moment wasn't just about the denial. It was about the deliberate nature of it. The quiet but undeniable certainty in her voice that made it clear this wasn't a misunderstanding or a simple business decision. He let the silence stretch, measuring the space between them, aware that everyone in the diner was still watching, still waiting. A cough broke the tension. JD turned slightly to see an older man at the counter, the same one who had been picking at his eggs, shake his head slightly before stabbing at his food again, his gaze deliberately avoiding JD's. A few booths away, the younger man who had been watching with arms crossed leaned back further, a smirk playing at the corner of his mouth, like he had been expecting this exact scenario to unfold. JD had seen this kind of scene play out before, not exactly like this, but close enough. Moments where a decision wasn't just about one person, but about what that decision represented. His eyes flickered past the hostess toward the kitchen window, where two cooks stood half-hidden behind the heat lamp stacked with plates, their faces unreadable. He exhaled through his nose, adjusting his stance, his mind running through the possibilities of what to do next. He had options. He could turn around and walk out, let it go, pretend it didn't happen. That would be the easiest choice, the least disruptive one. Or he could demand an explanation, push back, ask them if they knew exactly who they were refusing, make them justify this decision in front of everyone. He could make a call, let the press get wind of it, turn this into a headline that would put this small-town diner under a microscope overnight. But he did none of those things. Instead, he nodded slowly, his voice measured. "All right," he said, tilting his head slightly. "Can I speak with the manager?" That caught a few people off guard. The hostess hesitated, her confidence flickering for the first time, like she hadn't expected him to respond so calmly, hadn't expected him to stay. She glanced toward the kitchen, her expression uncertain, as if silently asking for permission. The older man at the counter muttered something under his breath, and from the corner booth, the younger guy let out a sharp laugh, shaking his head. "This ain't that deep," he said, voice edged with amusement. "You're just not welcome here. Simple as that." JD ignored him, keeping his focus on the hostess. She shifted on her feet, then disappeared through a different door, leaving him standing there once again, alone in the center of the diner, the tension thick in the air. A few more beats of silence, a sip of coffee, a plate being slid across the counter. Then the door swung open, and a man in his early 50s stepped out. Broad-shouldered, thick arms crossed over a grease-stained apron, his name tag read, Don. He didn't ask JD what he wanted. He didn't offer a polite greeting. He just looked him over once, his jaw tightening slightly before he spoke. "I hear you got a question." But the way he said it wasn't welcoming. It wasn't even polite. It was a challenge. JD met Don's stare, steady and unreadable. He wasn't here to argue. He wasn't here to throw his weight around, but he also wasn't about to walk out without understanding why. "Yeah," JD said, his voice level. "I'd like to know why you won't serve me." Don exhaled sharply through his nose, like he had been expecting the question but still wasn't in the mood to answer it. He wiped his hands on his apron, glancing around the diner at the handful of customers still watching the exchange. Some pretended not to listen, eyes fixed on their plates, but others didn't bother hiding their curiosity. "Look," Don said, shifting his weight slightly. "This ain't personal." JD raised an eyebrow. "Seems pretty personal." Don's jaw tightened. He rubbed the back of his neck, then finally sighed, like he had been holding something back and was finally letting it go. "People around here got their opinions about you, about the things you stand for." He let the words hang there for a moment, then shrugged. "I got a business to run and I don't want trouble." JD nodded slowly, letting the words settle, feeling the unspoken weight behind them. "And me sitting down for a meal is trouble?" Don didn't answer right away. He glanced toward the counter where the old man in the work jacket had gone back to his eggs, chewing a little slower now. A few booths away, the younger guy was still watching, still smirking like this was the best entertainment he'd had all week. JD had seen this before. Not just about him, but about people making choices they weren't sure about the pressure to go along with what was expected. He studied Don for a moment before speaking again. "Be honest with me. Do you agree with this, or is this just about keeping the peace?" Don hesitated. His fingers curled slightly against his apron, and for the first time, JD saw something that almost looked like discomfort, like maybe Don wasn't as sure about this decision as he wanted to seem. But before the man could answer, the younger guy in the booth scoffed loudly. "Oh, come on," he said, shaking his head. "This ain't that deep. You're just not welcome here." JD turned toward him, studying him for a moment. The guy looked like someone who enjoyed a good fight, someone who had been waiting for an excuse to say something, but JD didn't bite. He just looked back at Don. "I've got no problem leaving if that's really what you want." The words hung there, giving Don a chance to take a breath, to reconsider, to push back against whatever pressure had led to this moment. Don's gaze flicked toward the kitchen, then back to JD. Finally, he let out a slow breath. "I just don't want things to get ugly." JD nodded. "Neither do I." JD Vance stood firm, his expression steady, his breathing controlled. He had been in enough rooms, on enough stages, in enough debates, to know when people expected a reaction from him. The younger guy in the booth was waiting for him to lash out, to push back, to raise his voice and confirm whatever assumptions had already been made. The older man at the counter, stirring his coffee slowly, was watching but with a different energy, like someone who had seen too many of these moments before, someone who had stopped expecting anything different. Don, still gripping the back of the chair in front of him, exhaled again, shifting slightly on his feet as if trying to decide what would happen next. JD could feel the weight of the moment pressing in on him, the unspoken tension hanging in the air, the quiet expectation from everyone in the room that he would either fight or walk away. He could see the paths laid out before him. Storming out would be the easiest option, shaking his head and muttering something about people never changing. Or he could challenge them, force them to acknowledge what was happening, make them justify their decision in front of the entire diner. That would certainly make for a headline. And JD knew well enough that turning this into a public spectacle would only take one phone call. But he had no interest in that. He wasn't here to prove a point to the internet, and he wasn't here to turn himself into a victim. He was here to understand. He let the silence settle. Then, in a voice that was even and measured, said, "Then let's talk." The words landed like a crack in the tension, unexpected and disarming. Don blinked, taken slightly off guard, and even the younger man in the booth lost his smirk for just a second. JD didn't slam the chair down, didn't puff up his chest, didn't escalate. He simply sat. He pulled out a chair at an empty table, rested his hands on the surface, and looked at Don with the patience of someone who had all the time in the world. You don't want me here, I get that. What I don't get is why, so let's talk about it. A low chuckle came from the younger guy in the booth. Man, this guy's got nerve. JD ignored him, keeping his attention on Don. For a moment, the manager just stood there, his fingers still curled against the back of the chair, his shoulders still tense. He glanced toward the kitchen, then at the counter, then back at JD, as if measuring the reaction of the room before deciding his next move. Slowly, reluctantly, he pulled the chair out and sat down across from JD, his arms resting against the table. Talk, he repeated, the word sounding strange in this context, as if it didn't quite belong in a situation like this. JD nodded. You said people here don't like politicians, that they don't trust me, that some of the things I've said and stood for don't sit right with them. Fair enough, but you don't know me personally, do you? Don hesitated. Not personally, no. JD tilted his head slightly. Then tell me, if I was just some guy walking in here, not someone you've seen on TV, would we even be having this conversation? Silence. A pause stretched between them, and JD could see the moment Don considered his answer, the flicker of uncertainty in his face, the way his fingers tapped lightly against the table as he processed the question. It was a simple one, but it wasn't easy. Because the truth was, if JD had been just another man off the street, a stranger looking for a meal, none of this would have happened. From the back of the room, the younger guy scoffed. This isn't about TV, man. It's about people knowing who you really are. JD turned toward him. And who am I? The guy grinned, sitting up a little straighter like he had been waiting for this moment. You're the guy who acts like he understands regular people, but you play politics like everyone else. JD nodded slowly, considering the words. All right, he said, then tell me, what should I have done differently? That wasn't the response the guy had been expecting. He blinked, his confidence flickering for the first time. JD kept his voice level. You want me gone? Fine, but you've got the floor. Say what you need to say. The diner was silent now. Even the kitchen had gone still. No clinking plates, no orders being called out. Don sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. This ain't what I expected tonight. JD cracked a small, tired smile. Me neither. But for the first time, the tension wasn't just about division. It was about something else, something closer to understanding. Don leaned back slightly in his chair, his arms still crossed, his face unreadable. The diner had fallen into a strange sort of quiet, the kind where people were still pretending not to listen but were in reality hanging on to every word. JD Vance knew this kind of silence well. It was the silence that came when people wanted a fight but weren't sure they were going to get one. He let the moment settle before speaking again, his voice steady, his tone even. You said people here don't trust politicians, that they don't trust me, I get that. But I walked in here tonight as a customer, not as a politician. So I'm asking you, Don, if I was just another guy coming in for a meal, would we even be having this conversation? Don exhaled through his nose, tapping his fingers lightly against the table, his eyes flicking toward the counter where the old man in the work jacket sat, still stirring his coffee, still pretending not to listen. JD could see the hesitation in Don's posture, the way his fingers curled slightly against his apron, the way his shoulders stayed tense. This wasn't just about JD. It was about the diner, the customers, the people who had been whispering the second he walked in, about the expectations placed on Don the moment JD had stepped through that door. Don shook his head slightly, his voice lower when he finally spoke. People around here, they got long memories. They remember every promise made to them, every handshake, every speech, and every time someone walked away and didn't come back. His gaze hardened slightly. And they don't forget. JD nodded, letting the words settle. And do you think I'm one of those people? Don didn't answer right away. He glanced around the room, his eyes moving from one customer to the next, as if searching for an answer he wasn't sure he had. I don't know, he admitted finally. What I do know is that a lot of folks here don't believe in guys like you. They think you talk a good game, but when it comes down to it, nothing changes. JD tilted his head slightly, considering that. And what do you think? Don let out a short, humorless chuckle. I think I got a business to run, and I think people here don't like to feel like they're being used. They don't want a politician walking in, shaking hands, making a big deal out of something that doesn't need to be a big deal. JD nodded again, understanding the weight of what Don was really saying. This wasn't about politics, not really. This was about trust, and trust, especially in places like this, wasn't given easily. I get that, JD said after a moment. You don't want a scene. You don't want this turning into something bigger than it needs to be. He tapped a knuckle against the table, thoughtful. But tell me, don't me, sitting here, having a meal, does that really cause a problem for you? Or is the problem that some people expect you to turn me away? Don didn't answer right away, but JD saw the way his jaw tightened, the flicker of something in his expression that suggested he knew exactly what JD was talking about. There were expectations placed on him the moment JD walked in, the kind of expectations that came from years of people in this town deciding who belonged and who didn't. Finally, Don sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. I don't want things to get ugly. JD met his eyes. Neither do I. Another pause, this one heavier than before. The younger guy in the booth, the one who had been smirking and waiting for a fight, let out a scoff. Man, why are we still talking about this? He's not welcome here. It's not that deep. JD turned toward him, his expression calm. Why not? The guy blinked, thrown off for just a second. Because people don't want you here. JD nodded. And why is that? The guy rolled his eyes. Because you pretend to care about working-class folks, but you play politics just like everyone else. JD considered that for a moment. All right, he said. Then tell me, what should I have done differently? The younger guy hesitated, shifting slightly in his seat, suddenly realizing he had been given the floor, but didn't know what to do with it. The confidence he had a moment ago wavered, and JD could see the moment he realized that this wasn't a fight. This was a conversation, and conversations required more than just throwing out insults and expecting people to take the bait. Don, watching all of this unfold, shook his head slightly, his fingers still tapping against the chair. This isn't what I expected tonight, he muttered. JD gave him a small, tired smile. Me neither. But for the first time, the energy in the room felt different. It wasn't just about hostility anymore. It was about the fact that JD was still here. He hadn't stormed out. He hadn't shouted or turned this into a headline. He had simply stayed, listened, and asked questions. And now, the room wasn't sure what to do with that. The old man at the counter, the one who had been silent up until now, finally spoke, his voice rough but steady. Damn shame when a man can't even get a burger. The tension cracked just slightly. A few people smirked. Even Don let out a short chuckle, shaking his head. JD turned back to him. So what now? Don exhaled, looking toward the kitchen, where the cooks were still watching, then back at JD. Finally, he sighed and stood up. I'll tell you what, he said. You sit here and finish this conversation, and if by the end of it, I don't think you're just another guy talking a good game, maybe, just maybe, I'll have my waitress bring you a menu. JD nodded, a small smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. Sounds like a deal. And for the first time, the room didn't feel divided. It felt like something else, like a conversation worth having. JD Vance could have walked out. He could have shaken his head, muttered something about small-town attitudes, and left without another word. That would have been easy, expected even. But instead, he chose to stay, to lean into the moment rather than retreat from it. He had spent enough time in places like this to know that real conversations don't happen when people yell. They happen when people listen. And so, as Don sat back down across from him, arms still crossed, shoulders still tense, JD simply folded his hands on the table and met his gaze. All right, he said. Let's talk. The diner remained unusually quiet, the usual clatter of plates and hum of conversation replaced by an almost palpable sense of anticipation. This wasn't the kind of moment people saw every day, a politician sitting across from a man who had just refused him service, choosing to listen rather than fight. The younger guy in the booth let out an exasperated laugh, shaking his head. Man, this is ridiculous. JD didn't acknowledge him this time, keeping his focus on Don, waiting. He had seen the flicker of uncertainty in Don's expression before, the way his fingers had tapped against the chair, the way he had hesitated before giving JD that small opening. That was all JD needed. Don exhaled slowly, rubbing the back of his neck, clearly weighing the risks of engaging in this conversation at all. "You want to know why people around here don't trust you?" he finally said, voice lower now, as if reluctant to give the words weight. "Because they don't trust anyone in your position. They've been lied to too many times, told what they wanted to hear, promised things that never happened. And every time it's the same damn story. Politicians come through town, shake hands, act like they care, then disappear until they need votes again." He shook his head. "And we're supposed to just keep believing in it? And we're supposed to just keep believing in it?" JD let the words settle before he responded. "I get that," he said evenly. "I grew up around people who felt the same way. Hell, I've felt that way myself." He leaned forward slightly. "But let me ask you this. If we stop talking to each other completely, then what? What changes?" Don didn't answer right away, but JD could see the wheels turning in his head, the way his expression shifted just slightly. This wasn't about JD personally. It was about the weight of years, of disappointments, of feeling like no one ever really listened. The old man at the counter stirred his coffee, glancing sideways at them but still not speaking. The waitress behind the counter shifted on her feet, her gaze flickering between JD and Don, waiting, just like everyone else. The tension was no longer thick with hostility. It was something else now, something closer to curiosity. The younger guy in the booth, still leaning back with his arms crossed, let out a scoff. "Man, stop acting like this is about some big conversation. You're not welcome. It's that simple." JD turned toward him, studying him for a beat before responding. "You keep saying that, but you still haven't told me why." The guy blinked, his smirk faltering for just a second before he scoffed again. "Because people don't buy your act. You act like you get working people, but you still play politics like everyone else." JD considered that, nodding slowly. "All right," he said. "Then tell me what I should have done differently." That threw the guy off. He had been expecting a debate, maybe even an argument, but not an open invitation to speak his mind. He hesitated, shifting slightly in his seat. "I mean, I don't know, just don't pretend to be one of us when you're not." JD tilted his head slightly. "And what makes someone one of you?" The guy opened his mouth, then closed it, frustration flashing in his eyes. He didn't have an answer, not really, and JD knew why, because this wasn't about proving himself to them. It was about whether they were willing to let go of their assumptions long enough to listen. Don, still watching this exchange unfold, finally sighed and ran a hand over his face. "Look," he said, "I don't know if you're the guy people think you are. I don't know if you mean half the things you say or if you're just good at talking, but I do know one thing. Most people in your position wouldn't have stayed." Maybe that's the problem. Maybe too many people just walk away instead of having these conversations. Don huffed out a short, almost amused breath, shaking his head. "You think talking makes a difference?" JD nodded. "I think it's the only thing that ever has." The old man at the counter, who had been silent this whole time, finally spoke, his voice rough but steady. "Damn shame when a man can't even get a burger." The tension cracked just slightly. A few people smirked. The younger guy in the booth frowned but said nothing, and even Don let out a short chuckle. JD turned back to him. "So what now?" Don exhaled, looking toward the kitchen, where the cooks were still watching, then back at. Finally, he sighed and stood up. "You sit here and finish this conversation, and if by the end of it I don't think you're just another guy talking a good game, maybe, just maybe, I'll have my waitress bring you a menu." JD nodded, a small smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Sounds like a deal," and for the first time the room didn't feel divided. It felt like something else, like a conversation worth having. The shift in the diner was subtle at first, not something loud or obvious, but a slow unraveling of tension, like a tightly wound rope loosening fiber by fiber. JD Vance remained seated, his hands still resting on the table, his posture relaxed, but he could feel the air in the room change. The energy was no longer as sharp, no longer waiting for a confrontation that never came. Instead, there was something else creeping into the space, Something quieter, something closer to curiosity. Don, still standing across from him, let out a breath that felt less like frustration and more like something closer to consideration. The younger man in the booth, who had been smirking and throwing out dismissive remarks, wasn't leaning back with quite as much ease anymore. His arms were still crossed, but his expression had lost some of its confidence, as if he was starting to wonder whether he had miscalculated how this would play out. The old man at the counter, the one who had kept his head down, who had muttered about a man not being able to get a burger, finally set his spoon down, rubbing his weathered hands together, not looking at JD, but not avoiding him either. Even the waitress behind the counter, who had been keeping her distance, seemed to ease up just slightly, her movements less rigid as she refilled a coffee cup with practiced ease. JD didn't rush to speak, didn't try to fill the silence with anything unnecessary. Sometimes, people just needed space to process. And this wasn't a situation that could be changed with a single sentence or a grand speech. This was about proving something, simply by staying. He had stayed, listened, asked questions instead of pushing back, and now, for the first time since he had walked through the door, it felt like maybe, just maybe, people were starting to see him as more than just a name they had an opinion about. Don ran a hand over his face, shaking his head slightly. "You know, I still don't know if I like you," he muttered. JD smirked. "That's all right. I don't need everyone to like me." Don let out a short, dry chuckle, but there wasn't any hostility in it this time. At the counter, the old man finally spoke again. "You're still just another politician," he said gruffly. "But you're the first one who didn't walk out." JD nodded, acknowledging the truth in those words. He wasn't here to change anyone's mind in one night, and he wasn't naive enough to think a single conversation would undo years of distrust. But what he did know was that small moments lead to bigger shifts. The younger guy in the booth still had his arms crossed, but he wasn't saying much now, and his eyes weren't filled with the same smug amusement as before. He was listening, even if he didn't want to admit it. The quiet murmurs in the diner had started to pick up again, the clatter of silverware against plates returning, the stiffness in people's shoulders easing ever so slightly. It wasn't a full transformation. It wasn't like JD had suddenly won everyone over, but he had done something just as important. He had changed the expectation of how this night would go, and that, in itself, meant something. Don glanced toward the kitchen, then back at JD, shaking his head as if he still wasn't sure what to make of this situation. Then, finally, he sighed. "Mary," he called toward the waitress. "Get him a menu." Mary hesitated for only a second before reaching for a laminated menu and walking it over to JD, placing it in front of him with an expression that was neither warm nor cold, just neutral, professional. JD nodded his thanks, flipping it open, though he wasn't really reading. The atmosphere in the diner had settled into something different, something that wasn't quite friendly but wasn't openly hostile anymore either. Conversations had started to pick up again. Silverware clinked against plates, coffee cups were refilled, and the tension that had once sat heavy in the air had thinned. It wasn't gone completely, but it was no longer suffocating. Don remained standing across from him, arms still crossed, still studying him, as if trying to figure out whether or not he had just made a mistake. JD could see it in his posture, the way his fingers tapped against his apron, the way his gaze flickered toward the other customers in the diner, reading their reactions just as much as JD was. This wasn't just about one man sitting down for a meal. It was about the message it sent, the quiet permission it gave others to rethink their assumptions, even if just a little. The younger guy in the booth, the one who had been so quick to throw out dismissive comments earlier, was now uncharacteristically quiet, still leaning back, still watching, but without the same air of smug amusement he had carried before. The old man at the counter had returned to his coffee, but every so often his gaze flickered toward JD, as if he was waiting to see what he would do next. JD set the menu down, finally looking back up at Don. "What's good here?" Don exhaled, shaking his head slightly before rubbing the back of his neck. "Meatloaf solid, burgers popular." JD nodded. "All right, I'll take the burger. Fries or onion rings?" Don smirked, but only a little. "Fries." He turned slightly toward the counter. "Mary, one burger, fries." The waitress nodded, scribbling the order down before walking back toward the kitchen, her movements now looser, less uncertain. JD leaned back slightly in his seat, watching as Don sat down across from him, sighing like he had just given in to something he had been resisting the whole night. "I still don't get you," Don admitted, shaking his head. "You could have left. Hell, you probably should have. But instead you sat here, let people take their shots at you, and now you're ordering a burger like none of that happened." JD chuckled, resting his forearms on the table. "Because none of it was personal, not really." Don scoffed. "Didn't feel that way a half hour ago." JD shrugged. "People have a right to their opinions, but people also have a right to change their minds." Don studied him for a long moment, then leaned back in his chair, glancing around the diner like he was seeing it from a different angle now. "You really believe that?" JD nodded. "Yeah, I do, because I've seen it happen." The words weren't meant to be grand or philosophical. They were simple, honest. Don didn't respond right away, just let out a slow breath, shaking his head to himself like he still wasn't sure what to make of any of this. The younger guy in the booth, the one who had been the loudest earlier, finally shifted in his seat, leaning forward slightly. "You know this doesn't change anything, right?" JD turned toward him, raising an eyebrow. "What doesn't?" The guy gestured vaguely. "You sitting here, eating a burger. You think that suddenly people are going to like you?" JD smirked, shaking his head. "Not at all. But I'm not here to be liked. I'm here to listen." The younger guy scoffed, but didn't have a comeback this time, just exhaled, rubbing his jaw before looking away. A few minutes later, Mary reappeared with a plate, setting JD's burger and fries in front of him without a word. He nodded his thanks, picking up the burger and taking a bite. He chewed thoughtfully, then swallowed before looking at Don. "Little dry." For a split second, the entire diner froze. Then Don let out a bark of laughter, shaking his head, and even the old man at the counter smirked. Mary muttered, "Well, if you don't like it, you can go somewhere else," but there was no bite to her words this time. JD grinned, taking another bite. "Nah, it's good." The diner felt different now. Not entirely changed, not completely shifted, but lighter. And sometimes, that was enough. JD Vance sat at the booth, chewing his burger. The tension that had once gripped the diner now reduced to something far less rigid, something that felt closer to normalcy. The air had shifted, not entirely free of resistance, but no longer thick with hostility. Conversations had resumed around him, the clinking of silverware and the occasional murmur filling the space in a way that suggested things were returning to their natural rhythm. And yet, there was an undeniable weight to what had just unfolded. Something unspoken but deeply felt by everyone in the room. JD wasn't naive enough to think that one meal, one conversation would undo years of distrust, that a single moment of connection would suddenly shift the way people saw him or what he represented. But he did know that this night had been different from how it was supposed to go. He wasn't supposed to sit down, he wasn't supposed to stay, he wasn't supposed to listen, but he had. And because of that, something had changed, even if only slightly. Don sat across from him, arms still crossed, but his posture far less defensive than before. His gaze flickered toward JD every so often, like he was still trying to figure him out, still deciding whether or not he had made a mistake by letting this go on as long as it had. The younger man in the booth, who had been so eager to dismiss JD earlier, was now quieter, stirring the ice in his glass absent-mindedly, as if he, too, was stuck in thought, unsure of what to make of what had just happened. The old man at the counter was still there, still sipping his coffee, but JD could feel the occasional glance in his direction, a subtle acknowledgement of the way things had unfolded. Even Mary, who had initially served him with a forced neutrality, now moved around the diner with an ease that suggested the room no longer carried the weight it had before. JD took another bite, swallowed, then leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table. "You know," he said, his voice casual but deliberate, "this isn't the first time I've walked into a place where people already had their minds made up about me." Don raised an eyebrow but said nothing, waiting for him to continue. JD gestured lightly. "I get it. People hear my name, they think they know who I am, what I stand for. Hell, I've done the same thing to others. It's human nature." He exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly. "But the thing is, I could have walked out tonight. I could have let this turn into another headline, let everyone go home feeling exactly the way they did when I walked in." He glanced around the room, his gaze sweeping over the customers who were still half listening, pretending to be absorbed in their meals, but clearly tuned in to every word. But that wouldn't have done a damn thing. Don tapped his fingers against the table, studying JD. So, what, you think staying here changed something? JD shrugged. I don't know. Maybe not. He picked up a fry, twirled it between his fingers before taking a bite. But I do know that if we stopped making assumptions long enough to listen, even just for a few minutes, we might be surprised at what we find out. Don exhaled sharply, shaking his head as if he wanted to dismiss the thought, but there was something in his expression, something closer to consideration than rejection. From the counter, the old man finally spoke again, his voice gravelly but firm. It's been a long time since someone sat in that seat and didn't just talk at us. JD looked over, meeting his gaze. Well, he said with a small smile, that's because most people like to talk more than they like to listen. The old man huffed out a short laugh but nodded in agreement, sipping his coffee. The younger guy in the booth finally spoke up, his voice quieter than before. Doesn't mean we're all going to start liking you. JD chuckled. I wouldn't expect you to. He met his gaze directly, holding it for a moment. But maybe next time you'll at least wait until I say something before you decide how you feel about it. The guy didn't have a response to that, just exhaled, shaking his head as he looked away. But there was no more bite in his posture, no more smugness in his expression. Don sighed, leaning back in his chair. I still don't know what to make of you. JD smirked, picking up his coffee. That's fair. Maybe that's a good thing. Don let out a small laugh, shaking his head. Yeah, well, I guess we'll see. He nodded toward JD's plate. Finish your burger. JD raised his coffee in a small, wordless toast before taking a sip, letting the warmth settle in his chest. The lesson in all of this wasn't about politics. It wasn't about proving a point or winning an argument. It was about the simple truth that people are more than the headlines attached to them, more than the assumptions we make before they ever open their mouths. And sometimes, all it took to remind people of that was staying in the conversation just long enough for them to see it for themselves. In life, we often find ourselves making quick judgments based on assumptions, past experiences, or societal narratives. It is human nature to categorize people, to decide who belongs and who does not before truly knowing them. However, the story of JD Vance at the diner reminds us of a fundamental truth. Listening is more powerful than reacting. Too often we close our minds before a conversation even begins, allowing preconceptions to dictate how we see the world and the people around us. But what happens when we choose to stay, to listen, to engage rather than retreat or escalate? We open doors to understanding, even in the smallest of ways. For older generations, this lesson is particularly meaningful. Many have lived through decades of change, political shifts, and cultural transformations. They have seen how divisions can harden when dialogue is abandoned, how communities fracture when people refuse to acknowledge each other's perspectives. The ability to pause, reflect, and listen before making judgments is a skill that can bring families closer, strengthen friendships, and mend fractured relationships. Instead of dismissing younger generations or those with differing views, a simple conversation, rooted in curiosity rather than confrontation, can bridge gaps that once seemed insurmountable. At its core, this story is about the power of patience, humility, and the willingness to understand rather than assume. The next time you find yourself ready to dismiss someone because of what you think you know about them, take a breath. Ask a question. Give them the space to be more than just an opinion you disagree with. You may be surprised at what you learn, and at the unexpected connections that can emerge from simply listening.